is these Southern representatives want a chance for slavery to extend, in particular, to the Kansas Territory. Now, the thing is, Kansas was part of the Louisiana Purchase. It's therefore under the jurisdiction of the Missouri Compromise because Kansas is its borders are north of the Missouri Compromise line, and so therefore, according to the Missouri Compromise, it cannot have slavery. And so, in order to get Southerners to vote on to vote yes for his plan to send the railroad through Chicago, Illinois, Stephen Douglas has to come up with a way to make it possible for slavery to extend to Kansas. And what he comes up with is a bill he introduces, which passes eventually, called the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And what the Kansas-Nebraska Act does is it repeals the Missouri Compromise. It basically gets rid of the Missouri Compromise. And the way Douglas got it passed was he argued along the lines of democracy, right? He argued that, our nation is a democracy, we're about letting the people decide, and he argues that Kansas and Nebraska territory reaches all the way up to the Canadian border, so this includes the Dakotas as well. And anyway, what he argues is that the people of Kansas and Nebraska ought to get to decide for themselves whether they want slavery. I mean, it sounds great. I mean, it sounds like you're really appealing to the sort of democratic tradition in America. What can be wrong with the people choosing for themselves? And that argument wins the day, as well as just Douglas's sort of growing power in the Senate. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed, and it creates two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska. And it says that, in each of these states, when it comes time to apply for statehood, that they will get to decide through their territorial legislatures whether or not they want to have slavery or not. Now, the thing is, it's pretty obvious slavery is not going to go to Nebraska, right? The people who are going to move to Nebraska, for the most part, by the overwhelming majority of them, are going to be from places like Iowa and Illinois and Wisconsin and Michigan, places where there is no slavery, okay? So the one possible extension of slavery, though, is Kansas, because a lot of the people who are going to move to Kansas are going to be from Missouri, which is a slave state. But also people who are going to move to Kansas from Iowa and Illinois and Indiana, places where there are not slaves. And so what the Kansas-Nebraska Act does, even though it sounds great to sort of let everybody sort of just decide, what it really is an open invitation for all of the activists and partisans and sort of ruffians on both sides. It's sort of an invitation to come to Kansas and fight it out. I mean, basically, whoever can get to Kansas with more people, and who can, or maybe if you don't even get there with more people, whoever can influence the elections in Kansas and elect people who are going to write a constitution that are for or against slavery, they win the day. And so Kansas, almost overnight, with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, becomes sort of the front lines for this growing debate and this increasingly violent debate over slavery. By this point, you've had instances in which people who have spoken out against slavery have been killed, and other instances in which slave rebellions, even though they don't happen successfully, there have been people killed, trying to free other slaves and all this sort of stuff. And so you have had violence occur between these two sides, and so Kansas just becomes again sort of the front lines for this war that is beginning to be waged between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces in America. And it's both a political war, and it is also a real honest-to-goodness war that uses guns and violence. Also, around this time, and in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, you actually have the birth of a new political party. Which makes this the youngest of the political parties we have with us today, and that's the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is born in regard to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, Stephen Douglas is a Democrat. And the Republican Party is unique in that it is a party that does not really seek to exist in the South. Okay? The Republican Party is a party that solely exists in the North. And it is made up of former Whigs. Okay, the Whig Party was destroyed, really, over the Kansas-Nebraska Act because the Whig Party had both pro-slavery members and anti-slavery members, and the debate over the Compromise of 1850 and the Nebraska Act got so heated between those two sections of the Whig Party that it split apart. The Democratic Party almost did, but it didn't. So the Republican Party is made up of former Whigs, people like Abraham Lincoln was a former Whig. He was a Whig. He was an anti-slavery Whig. Also, some former Democrats. There are certain Democrats, particularly in the North, states like New York and New England and places like that, who were sort of strict Jacksonian Democrats, right? And Jackson, even though he was a slaveholder, one of the things he's most known for is sort of this idea of the common man, right? And he distrusted banks. And often sort of kind of acted like banks were all in and businessmen were all in a conspiracy to rob the little guy, right? And this was oftentimes referred to as the money power. Jackson and his Democrats distrusted what they referred to as the money power. The money power was always out to rob the little person. Well, many of these people who had been so distrustful of the money power began to shift that distrust to another thing, which they referred to as the slave power. And there were many people, particularly in the North, both in the Whig and Northern Democrats, who came to believe in a thing called the slave power conspiracy. And this was the idea that the United States government had been taken over by the forces of slavery. That the United States government had been taken over by pro-slavery forces. Even though the United States is supposedly a democracy, there were more people who were against slavery in the United States because the North's population was much larger, and there were more northern states than there were southern states. There were more free states, ostensibly, than there were slave states by this point, because, of course, California is now a free state. Yet, for some reason, the United States government was dominated by slave owners. I mean, if you think about it, since the beginning of the United States government, since the passage of the Constitution, there had been one non-slave owning president. It was John Quincy Adams, and he'd only served one term, right? Washington, well, I guess, two. His father, John Adams, as well. There'd been two, the Adamses. That's it. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, Andrew Jackson. In addition, Congress, most of the leaders of Congress, John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, tended to come from slave states. In addition, even before the abolitionist movement, the people who were against slavery were Quakers, right? And the Quakers weren't really militantly against slavery. They didn't go protest. They didn't, advocate, rebellion or things like that. What they usually did was they just sent petitions to the floor of Congress that basically said, slavery is immoral, it's wrong, you should change it. And the way that Congress used to work up until the Missouri Compromise debate got so heated was that if a member of Congress, or if a constituent, a person who lived in a member of Congress's district, sent them a petition, the congressman, up till about the 1820s, felt honor-bound to read it in front of Congress, even if they didn't agree with it. They just felt that was part of representing your constituents. And so you would go to the floor with the petition that your constituent had sent you, and you would read it. And everybody knew that doesn't necessarily mean you agree with it, but you're doing your duty as a representative of the people. Well, after the Missouri Compromise debate got so heated, and particularly after the Nat Turner Rebellion, Southern members of Congress insisted on a thing known as the gag rule, which was basically the banning of the reading of anti-slavery petitions on the floor of Congress. And it passed. Northern members of Congress ended up going along with it because Southerners threatened to basically grind Congress to a halt and not consider any bills or anything that the Northerners wanted to get done. And so they basically blackmailed Northern members of Congress. And so many people, particularly Democrats who believed in this thing called the money power conspiracy, and former Whigs began to look at this and say, wait a sec. For being a minority in this country, slave owners seem to have an inordinate amount of power over our government. And then when something like the Kansas-Nebraska Act happened, or even the Compromise of 1850, where you have this fugitive slave law that favors the idea of finding that people are fugitive slaves even though they might not be, and then you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which completely gets rid of the Missouri Compromise and opens Kansas, which had always been considered to be a place that was going to be a free state, opens it up to the forces of slavery. There's something at work here. something at work behind the scenes, and many of them had come to believe that the U.S. government was under the